You can tell a lot about people by how they treat someone they think can't pay the bill. That was the first thought that crossed my mind the moment Richard Hayes leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of wine that probably cost more than my first car, and looked straight at me like I didn't belong at the table. The restaurant was one of those places where everything was designed to remind you how much money you didn't have: soft lighting, white tablecloths so crisp they looked untouched, waiters who moved like they were part of a quiet performance. Olivia sat beside me, elegant as always, her hand resting lightly near mine but not quite touching it, like even she wasn't sure where I stood anymore. Her mother, Margaret, smiled in that polite, practiced way that never quite reached her eyes, the kind of smile reserved for people you tolerate rather than respect. I had seen that smile before, just never directed at me this openly. "So Ethan," Margaret said, tilting her head slightly as she glanced at the menu, "what do you usually order at a place like this?" It wasn't really a question. It was a setup. I could feel it. I gave a small shrug, keeping my voice even. "Whatever looks good." Richard chuckled under his breath, setting his glass down with a soft clink. "Let's hope that's not the most expensive thing on the menu," he said, loud enough for the table, and the nearby ones, to hear. Olivia didn't say anything. She just kept looking at her menu like she hadn't heard him. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the words. Not even the tone. It was the silence from the one person who was supposed to be on my side. The waiter came over, professional and composed, asking if we were ready to order drinks. Richard didn't hesitate. He ordered a bottle of wine I recognized immediately, not because I had ever bought it, but because I knew exactly what it cost, just over $1,200. Margaret nodded approvingly, adding a few appetizers without even glancing at me. Then Richard looked at me again, that same measured expression, like he was studying something mildly disappointing. "You okay with that, Ethan?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he wasn't really asking for permission. I met his gaze and nodded. "That's fine." He smiled, satisfied, like he had just confirmed something he already believed. As the night went on, the comments didn't stop. They just got sharper. Subtle at first, then less so. Little remarks about financial stability, about providing for a family, about how important it was to know your limits. Each one carefully placed, each one aimed directly at me. And every time, I let it pass. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just sat there, listening, watching, letting them build their version of who they thought I was. Because the truth was, I wasn't there to prove anything. I was there to let them reveal everything. By the time Richard ordered the final round, an extra dish no one had touched, just because he could, I already knew how this was going to end. I just needed them to take it one step further. And when the waiter placed the leather folder with the bill gently at the edge of the table, sliding it toward Richard like it belonged to him, I saw the moment he had been waiting for all night. He didn't even open it right away. He just pushed it across the table, straight toward me. The bill stopped halfway between us, resting just within my reach, and for a moment no one said anything, like the entire table was waiting for a reaction they could measure. Richard leaned back again, folding his arms with that same quiet confidence, like this was the part of the night where everything finally made sense to him. Margaret glanced at me, then at Olivia, then back at me, her expression softening just enough to look polite while still carrying that same underlying judgment. "Go ahead," she said lightly, as if she was offering me something generous instead of setting me up. Olivia finally looked up from her plate, her eyes meeting mine for a second before drifting back down again. Not support. Not even discomfort. Just distance. I picked up the leather folder slowly, feeling the weight of it more in the moment than in the actual paper inside. The total was exactly what I expected, just over $3,000 after everything Richard had ordered. It was not the number that mattered. It was what they thought that number meant. I closed the folder without saying anything and set it back down on the table. Richard let out a small laugh, shaking his head like he had just watched a predictable ending play out. "That is what I thought," he said, reaching forward as if to take it back. "No need to embarrass yourself, Ethan. I have got this." His words were calm, but they carried just enough volume to make sure the people at the next table could hear. That was intentional. Everything about tonight had been intentional. I kept my hands where they were, resting calmly on the table, and looked at him. "Are you sure?" I asked. It was a simple question, but it made him pause for half a second longer than I expected. Not because he doubted himself, but because he did not expect me to say anything at all. "Of course I am," he replied, smiling again, more firmly this time. "A man should take care of these things." Margaret nodded in agreement, adding quietly, "It is about responsibility." Olivia still said nothing. I could feel the weight of that more than anything else in the room. The waiter approached again, standing just slightly behind Richard, waiting for a signal. Everything slowed down in that moment, not because time actually changed, but because I had seen this exact situation play out before, just from the other side. Richard reached for the folder, but before his hand could touch it, I spoke again, my voice steady and low. "You might want to wait," I said. That was when the waiter shifted his attention from Richard to me. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you were paying attention, but I noticed the change immediately. His posture straightened just a little, his expression becoming more focused. Recognition. Not loud, not obvious, but there. I did not look at him. Not yet. Instead, I kept my eyes on Richard, watching the slight confusion settle into his expression as the moment stopped following the script he had written in his head. Because what they did not understand, what none of them had bothered to understand, was that this was never about whether I could pay the bill. It was about who actually owned the table they were sitting at. Richard did not pull his hand back immediately, but he did not move it forward either, and that hesitation was enough to change the energy at the table. For the first time that night, he looked uncertain, not in a dramatic way, just a slight shift in his posture, like something small had slipped out of place. Margaret noticed it too. Her eyes moved from him to me, studying my face like she was trying to find the joke she thought she had missed. Olivia finally looked up again, this time holding her gaze on me a little longer, her expression tightening just slightly, like something about this moment did not feel as simple as it had a few seconds ago. The waiter stepped closer, his attention no longer divided. "Sir," he said quietly, directing his voice toward me instead of Richard, "would you like me to take care of this now?" That single sentence landed heavier than anything that had been said all night. Richard frowned, turning his head toward the waiter. "He said he is not paying," he replied, his tone controlled but edged with irritation, as if correcting a mistake. The waiter did not respond to him. He just remained where he was, waiting. Waiting on me. I let a few seconds pass, not to create drama, but because I wanted them to sit in that silence, to feel the shift without fully understanding it yet. Then I reached for the folder again, opening it this time and glancing at the total like it was nothing more than a receipt I had seen 100 times before. "It is fine," I said, my voice calm. "Go ahead." The waiter nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and reached forward, but instead of taking a card or waiting for cash, he closed the folder himself and held it against his chest for a moment. "Of course, Mr. Carter," he said. The name hung in the air longer than it should have. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because of how he said it. There was no question in his voice, no uncertainty. Just recognition. Richard's expression shifted again, more noticeably this time. "You know him?" he asked, looking between the waiter and me, trying to piece together something that did not fit his version of the night. The waiter gave a polite smile, the kind reserved for situations where too much explanation would be unnecessary. "Yes, sir," he said simply, then turned his attention back to me. "Everything this evening has already been arranged." Margaret blinked, clearly caught off guard, her composure slipping just enough to reveal confusion underneath. "Arranged," she repeated softly. Olivia's hand moved slightly on the table, her fingers curling inward like she was starting to connect something she had never bothered to question before. I did not rush to explain. That was the mistake most people made in moments like this. They tried to fill the silence. I let it grow instead. Let it settle over the table until it became impossible to ignore. Because what they were starting to realize, piece by piece, was that this dinner had never been what they thought it was. Not a test of whether I could afford to be there. Not a performance they could control. It was something else entirely. Something they had walked into without understanding. And the longer they sat there, the clearer it became that the assumptions they had built all night were beginning to collapse under their own weight. Richard's fingers slowly pulled back from the table, like he had just realized he had reached for something that was never his to take in the first place. The confidence that had carried him through the entire evening did not disappear all at once, but it cracked just enough to be visible. He straightened in his chair, adjusting his posture as if that alone could restore control. "What exactly does that mean?" he asked, his voice measured but no longer effortless. The waiter remained composed, still standing slightly behind me, but his attention stayed where it had shifted moments ago. "It means, sir," he said carefully, choosing his words with professional precision, "that this table, and all services provided tonight, have already been covered under Mr. Carter's account." The word account landed differently this time. Not like a casual explanation. More like a detail that carried weight they had not considered. Margaret's expression tightened, her polite smile fading completely now. "Account?" she repeated, her tone sharper than before, as if questioning the legitimacy of what she was hearing might somehow undo it. Olivia's eyes moved from the waiter to me again, but this time there was something else there. Not confusion alone. Recognition trying to form. "Ethan," she said quietly, "what is he talking about?" I did not answer her immediately. Instead, I looked at the waiter for a brief second and gave a small nod. That was enough. He stepped back slightly, giving the table space, but not leaving. He knew better than to interrupt what was about to unfold. I folded my hands calmly on the table, glancing at the empty plates, the untouched portions of food Richard had ordered simply to make a point. Then I looked back at him. "You said something earlier," I began, my tone even, almost conversational. "About a man taking care of these things." Richard held my gaze, but there was a flicker of hesitation now, a subtle awareness that the ground beneath the conversation had shifted. "That is right," he replied, though it sounded more like a reflex than a statement of belief. I nodded slightly. "You are not wrong." I let that sit for a second before continuing. "The only difference is, you assumed you were the one doing it." The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just undeniable. Margaret looked at Olivia, searching for some kind of explanation, but Olivia did not have one. She was still looking at me, her expression now fully changed, like she was replaying every moment of the night in her head and seeing it differently. Richard exhaled slowly, forcing a small smile that did not quite hold. "If this is some kind of misunderstanding," he said, "we can clear it up right now." I shook my head once. "There is no misunderstanding." I leaned back slightly in my chair, mirroring the position he had taken earlier in the evening, but without the need to prove anything. "This restaurant is part of a group of properties managed under Carter Holdings." I watched the words register, not all at once, but in pieces. "And every reservation made here under my name is handled before the bill ever reaches the table." Margaret's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Olivia's hand, which had been resting near mine all night without touching it, slowly pulled back into her lap. Richard stared at me, the realization finally settling in, not as a shock, but as something heavier. Something that could not be laughed off or dismissed. Because what he had spent the entire night trying to prove, what he had tried to display in front of everyone, had already been decided long before he walked through the door. And he had never been the one in control of it. No one reached for their glass anymore. The table that had felt so controlled just minutes ago now sat in a kind of quiet imbalance, like everything had shifted a few inches off center and no one knew how to fix it. Richard looked down at the empty folder, then back at me, his expression tightening as he tried to recover something that had already slipped away. "You are saying," he began slowly, choosing each word with care, "that you own this place?" I did not rush to answer. I let the question sit there for a moment, not because I needed time, but because they did. "Not just this one," I said finally. "This is just one location." That was enough. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her posture no longer composed but guarded, like she had just realized she had misjudged something important. "Why would you not say anything?" she asked, her tone no longer polite, but edged with something closer to defensiveness. I looked at her calmly. "You did not ask." It was not meant to be sharp, but it landed that way anyway. Olivia shifted slightly in her seat, her hands now folded tightly in her lap, her eyes moving between her parents and me like she was trying to understand where she stood in all of this. "Ethan," she said quietly, "this is not funny." I met her gaze, steady and direct. "I am not trying to be funny." The difference in tone was enough to make her look away again. Richard let out a breath, shaking his head as if trying to reset the conversation back to something he could control. "If this is true," he said, "then you should have made that clear from the beginning." I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. "Would it have changed anything?" I asked. That question stopped him again. Not because it was complicated, but because it forced him to confront something simple. Margaret glanced at him, then back at me, her silence saying more than any response could. Because the truth was, it would have changed everything. Not the dinner. Not the setting. But the way they treated me. And that was exactly the point. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table, my voice still calm, still controlled. "Tonight was not about the money," I said. "It was about what you assumed the money meant." No one interrupted. No one argued. Even Olivia stayed quiet now, her earlier distance replaced with something heavier, something closer to realization. Richard's jaw tightened, his confidence no longer gone, but reshaped into something defensive. "We were just trying to understand where you stand," he said. I gave a small nod. "And now you do." The words were simple, but they closed the gap between what they thought they knew and what was actually true. Margaret looked down at the table, her fingers lightly touching the edge of her glass without lifting it. Olivia exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping just slightly, like she had been holding tension she did not realize was there. And Richard, for the first time that night, had nothing immediate to say. Because the version of me they had built over the course of the evening no longer fit the reality sitting across from them. And the hardest part for people in that moment is not accepting the truth. It is realizing how easily they believed something else in the first place. The silence did not break all at once, it stretched, slow and deliberate, like something neither side wanted to touch first. I could see it in the way Richard adjusted his watch even though it did not need adjusting, in the way Margaret kept her eyes down for just a second too long before forcing herself to look back up, and in the way Olivia sat perfectly still, like any movement might make this moment more real than she was ready to accept. I had seen this shift before, not in this exact room, not with these exact people, but enough times to recognize what came next. It was not denial. That would have been easier. It was recalculation. Richard cleared his throat lightly, leaning forward again, trying to reframe the conversation into something he could still control. "So what exactly is it that you do, Ethan?" he asked, his tone more careful now, less certain, but still holding on to the idea that there had to be a version of this he could understand. I met his gaze without hesitation. "I manage assets," I said simply. That answer was true, but it was also incomplete, and he knew it. "That is a broad answer," he replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It usually is," I said. Margaret shifted in her seat, her earlier composure replaced with a more direct kind of curiosity, the kind people have when they realize they might have underestimated something valuable. "You are saying you own multiple locations like this?" she asked. I nodded once. "Through a holding structure, yes. I could see the question forming behind her expression before she asked it. And Olivia knew about this? That was the first time Olivia's name had been pulled directly into the center of the conversation since everything shifted. I turned my head slightly toward her, giving her the space to answer if she wanted to. She did not. Her silence said enough. I looked back at Margaret. We never really discussed it in detail, I said. That answer landed heavier than any explanation would have. Because it was not just about money anymore. It was about what had never been important enough to ask. Richard exhaled slowly, leaning back again, but this time the movement did not carry confidence. It carried adjustment. You understand how this looks, he said, gesturing slightly around the table. You sit here, let us believe one thing, and then, he trailed off, not finishing the sentence, but the implication was clear. I nodded, acknowledging the point without agreeing to the conclusion. I did not make you believe anything, I said calmly. I just did not correct you. That distinction mattered more than he wanted it to. Margaret's lips pressed together, her expression tightening again, not with judgment this time, but with something closer to reflection. Olivia finally spoke. Her voice quieter than it had been all night. Why would you not tell me, she asked. That question was different. It was not about status or control. It was personal. I held her gaze for a moment before answering. Because it should not have mattered, I said. There was no accusation in my tone, no edge, just a statement of fact. But it carried weight anyway. Because if it truly did not matter, then tonight would have looked very different. Richard let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. In my experience, he said, it always matters. I nodded slightly. In yours, maybe. I leaned back in my chair, letting the tension settle into something quieter, something more defined. But I have spent a long time learning that people show you what matters to them without you having to say a word. No one interrupted. No one argued. The waiter remained nearby, silent and observant, as if he understood that this moment had moved beyond service and into something else entirely. Margaret looked at Olivia again, this time not for guidance, but with a kind of unspoken question, like she was trying to understand what her daughter had actually chosen. Olivia did not respond. She just sat there, her expression no longer distant, but unsettled, like the version of me she had been comfortable with no longer matched the reality in front of her. Richard straightened slightly, his voice lower now, more controlled. Well, he said, this has certainly been informative. I gave a small nod. That is one way to put it. The words were simple, but they marked the point where the evening had fully changed. Because whatever assumptions had been made when we first sat down were no longer holding. And the difference between what they thought they understood and what was actually true was now too clear to ignore. The conversation did not pick back up the way it normally would after something like that. There was no smooth transition, no polite shift back to safe topics, just a quiet tension sitting between all of us, heavier than anything that had been said out loud. I glanced briefly toward the waiter and gave a small nod, and he understood immediately, stepping forward. Just enough to place a fresh set of folded receipts on the table, not for payment, but for signature confirmation, a detail that most guests never even noticed. Everything has been finalized under your account, sir, he said quietly, placing the pen beside it with deliberate care. Richard's eyes followed the movement, sharper now, more focused, like he was trying to understand every detail he had previously ignored. Finalized, he repeated under his breath, as if testing the word. I picked up the pen and signed without looking down for more than a second, a motion that came from habit rather than effort. It was not about the number, it never was, it was about the position behind it. When I set the pen down, the waiter gave a slight nod and stepped back again, maintaining that respectful distance that only appears when roles are clearly defined. Margaret watched the entire exchange without speaking, her expression no longer guarded but measured, like she was reassessing everything she thought she knew about me, about Olivia, about the situation she had walked into so confidently just an hour earlier. Olivia finally leaned forward slightly, her voice quieter but steadier than before. "So this is what you do," she said, not really asking, more like confirming something she was still processing. I looked at her for a moment before answering. "It is part of what I do." That answer did not satisfy her, I could see it, but it was enough for now. Richard let out a slow breath, resting his elbows lightly on the table, his earlier authority replaced with something more controlled, more cautious. "You should have said something earlier," he said again, but this time there was less accusation in it, more realization. I shook my head once. "You had already decided who I was." That landed differently now. Not as a challenge, but as a conclusion. Margaret looked down briefly, then back up, her voice softer than it had been all evening. "We made assumptions," she admitted, the words coming slower than anything she had said before. I gave a small nod. "You did." There was no satisfaction in saying it, no need to press further. The point had already made itself. Olivia's hands rested together now, no longer distant, but not reaching for mine either. She was still somewhere in between, caught between what she thought she knew and what she was now seeing. "Ethan," she said carefully, "why did you let it go that far?" That question hung differently than the others. It was not about money or status, it was about intention. I held her gaze for a moment, then answered simply. "Because people rarely reveal themselves when they feel equal." I let that settle before continuing. "They do it when they think they have the advantage." No one interrupted. No one disagreed. Richard sat back slowly, the weight of the evening finally catching up to him, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet understanding that something had shifted beyond repair. Margaret's expression softened slightly, not out of sympathy, but out of recognition, like she was beginning to see the situation from a perspective she had not considered before. And Olivia, she just looked at me, longer this time, like she was seeing me clearly for the first time, not as the version she had accepted, but as the one she had never taken the time to understand. The dinner was over, but the silence that followed carried more meaning than anything that had been said, because in that silence, every assumption that had filled the room at the start of the night had already fallen apart. Richard was the first to move, not abruptly, not in a way that would draw attention from the rest of the restaurant, but enough to signal that he no longer felt comfortable sitting in the same position he had held all night. He reached for his glass, then stopped halfway, like even that small gesture no longer felt natural. Margaret adjusted her posture, her earlier composure replaced with a quiet restraint, the kind people use when they realize they have misjudged a situation and are trying not to make it worse. Olivia remained still, her eyes fixed on the table for a moment before slowly lifting back toward me, as if she was still deciding what this moment meant for her. I stood up calmly, not in a rush, not to make a statement, just because the evening had already reached its conclusion. The chair slid back softly against the floor, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the silence that followed. The waiter stepped forward again almost immediately, not to interrupt, but to acknowledge the shift. "Would you like anything else this evening, sir?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, thank you." He nodded once, stepping aside, his role complete. I reached for my jacket, adjusting it without looking at anyone in particular, then turned slightly toward the table. Richard met my gaze again, but this time there was no trace of the earlier confidence, only a controlled attempt to maintain dignity in a situation he no longer understood. "Ethan," he said, his voice lower now, more measured, "this was unexpected." I gave a small nod. That tends to happen when expectations are based on assumptions. The words were not harsh, but they did not need to be. Margaret exhaled quietly, her expression softer now, less guarded, more reflective. "We did not know," she said. I looked at her briefly. That was the point. Olivia stood up a second later, her movement slower, more hesitant, like she was still catching up to everything that had just happened. "Are you leaving?" she asked. I met her eyes, holding them for a moment longer than before. "Yes." She hesitated, then took a small step closer, her voice dropping slightly. "We should talk about this." I considered that for a second, not because I needed to think, but because I wanted to choose the right answer. "There is not much to talk about," I said calmly. "Everything important was already said tonight." That landed harder than anything else, not because of what it meant, but because of what it implied. Richard looked away briefly, his jaw tightening, while Margaret remained silent, her earlier certainty replaced with quiet acceptance. Olivia did not respond right away. She just stood there, her expression shifting again, not confused this time, but aware. Aware of what had been missed. Aware of what had been assumed. I picked up my keys from the table, glancing once more at the setting, the empty plates, the untouched portions, the remnants of a dinner that had been planned as a display but ended as a lesson. Then I looked back at them, my tone steady, unchanged. "You spent the entire night trying to prove something," I said. "The only problem is, you were proving it to the wrong person." No one argued. No one tried to correct it. Because there was nothing left to correct. I gave a small nod, not as a gesture of approval, but as a simple acknowledgement, then turned and walked toward the exit. The staff near the front straightened slightly as I approached, offering polite recognition without drawing attention, a quiet confirmation of everything that had already been made clear. And as I stepped out into the night air, leaving the restaurant and everything inside it behind, I knew one thing for certain. The version of me they had come to judge no longer existed in that room. And the version they had just seen was not one they could ignore anymore. I did not rush once I stepped outside, the cool night air settling in around me as the door closed quietly behind me, cutting off the weight of everything that had just unfolded inside. The street was calm, the kind of quiet that comes late in the evening when most of the city has already moved on, and for the first time that night, there was no tension to manage, no expectations to navigate, no assumptions pressing in from across a table. I stood there for a moment, not because I needed to think, but because I understood exactly what had just happened, and more importantly, what had not happened. There had been no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation. Just a series of choices, made long before that dinner ever began, revealing themselves exactly as they were. I had seen it before, in different rooms, with different people, but the pattern never really changed. People do not show you who they are when everything is equal. They show you when they believe they have the upper hand. And tonight, that belief had been clear from the very beginning. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone, not to check anything important, just a habit, a way to mark the moment before moving forward. There was already a message waiting. Olivia. I did not open it right away. I already knew what it would say, or at least what it would try to say. Questions. Explanations. Maybe even apologies. But none of that would change what had already been revealed. Because the most important part of the night was not what they said after the truth came out. It was what they said before they thought it mattered. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without reading it and started walking toward my car, my steps steady, unhurried. The reflection in the glass windows I passed showed the same thing I already knew. Nothing about me had changed. The only difference was that now they had seen it. And that changes things more than people realize. Back inside, they would be talking. Trying to piece it together. Replaying every moment, every word, every look, trying to understand where it shifted, where they missed it, where they got it wrong. But the truth is, they did not miss anything. They saw exactly what they expected to see. That was the problem. I reached my car and paused for a second before unlocking it, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity. Because moments like this are not about proving anything to anyone else. They are about understanding what you are willing to accept moving forward. Respect is not something you ask for. It is something people show when they believe you deserve it. And if they only show it after they discover what you have, then it was never really respect to begin with. I opened the door and got in, the interior quiet and familiar, a space that did not change based on who was sitting across from me or what they believed about me. As I started the engine, I thought briefly about the table I had just left behind, the empty glasses, the unfinished plates, the conversations that would continue long after I was gone. Then I let it go. Because some lessons do not need to be explained. They just need to be experienced. And tonight, they had been.